I'm so glad Linus was able to come because his presence alleviates the anxiety I always feel knowing that I'm the oldest person in a room. I've seen a lot of the TED Talks on television, and I'm always impressed with the fact that the people give them without notes. And I'm going to have to refer to notes because my short-term memory is not what it used to be. So I'll be using notes because my short-term memory is not what it used to be. You all know the story of Naaman in Kings. Naaman was a mighty general. He was very wealthy. He was well connected with the king of Aram. But he had a problem. He had leprosy. And of course, leprosy is a symbol in Scripture for sin. And his expectation in relation to his leprosy was that he was always going to have it because there was no cure. But he hears that there's a prophet in Israel that can cure leprosy. So Naaman's expectation changes. He now decides, I can put together a large fortune to pay for the cure, and I can get my king to send a letter of introduction to the king of Israel to pave the way to get to the prophet. And so he does that. He gets this letter of introduction from his king to the king of Israel. He puts together a fortune which is very sizable. Some of the commentaries say that in today's money it would have been around $800,000. And so he takes his men and his fortune and he goes down and he meets the king of Israel and presents him this letter of introduction. And the king does not behave in the way Naaman expects. The king goes ballistic and says, this is a trick. Who am I that I can cure leprosy? You're trying to get me involved in some kind of military conflict. And rips his robes. So Elisha hears about this and sends a messenger to the king and says, send this guy down to see me and I'll show him that there's a king in Israel. So now Naaman's expectation is that he'll go down, pay for the cure, meet with the prophet, things will be great. He goes down to meet Isaiah. When he gets there, Elisha, and Elisha won't even come out of his house to meet him, which of course is a tremendous insult. Elisha sends a messenger. And the messenger comes out and says a couple things. Number one, you can't pay for the cure. Number two, Elisha's not going to come out to see you. So Naaman is understandably insulted, gets very upset, and then the messenger says, you can be cured of your leprosy, though, if you go down and dip 7 times in the river. And the text says that Naaman flies into an absolute rage and says to all of his men, basically, this is not at all what I expected. I'm being humiliated. Let's go back home. He almost passes up the opportunity to be cured. And one of his servants, modern translation, says, hey boss, what do you got to lose? Like, you already got leprosy, you know what I mean? So Naaman embraces the unexpected. And he goes down, dips in the river, and in fact is cured. And of course there's more to the story. He not only is cured of his leprosy, he embraces the God of Israel and becomes a God follower. And I've always loved this story because I think it's so applicable to many of our lives. We're always expecting whatever it is we're expecting. And when we don't get what we're expecting, we're often thrown for a loop. Our expectations, however, can be unrealistic. They can be romanticized. They can even be irrational, like the person that is expecting to marry the perfect spouse. Hope I don't get in trouble for that. Our expectations can even lead us away from the plan God has for us, if they're faulty expectations. When you read through the Gospels, the apostles were expecting Jesus to set up this earthly kingdom, and when he's crucified, they're traumatized. They don't know what to think. For years, my life was a series of unrealized expectations that resulted in discouragement, failure, tremendous depression. When I was in high school, I had this art teacher named William Witkowski, and he thought I needed to go to Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. My parents lived on Long Island. I thought that would be cool, go to college near home, bring my laundry home. And I wanted to be an architect. And in those days, before computers and a lot of other things, strange things started to happen. About 2 months after I was accepted, my parents moved to Illinois. So I wasn't going to go to school near my parents. And at that time, you went to orientation week, and they had these tables set up, and over the table they had signs indicating the various majors. So I was in the architecture line, and completely unprepared, and I was reading the material that they handed out, and for the first time I realized that architecture was a 5-year program. So the other thing I noticed was that the program required that you take calculus. This was not a good thing because I had failed trigonometry in high school. So I made a step to the right in the graphic arts line and changed my expectation. My expectation was now to be an artist. And the next 2 years at Pratt were not happy ones. It didn't take me very long to discover that I had no talent. And I had to change my expectations again. So I did a sort of little self-evaluation. What do you need to be successful in life? Well, you need good looks, social skills, a charismatic personality, family connections, money. I didn't have any of those. And so I decided, well, hard work is going to be the key. I had learned a good work ethic, other than studying in high school. And I could do this. I could do this. So I was in my sophomore year, and my father came to visit me. He took me to see the film The Bridge on the River Kwai. I know that many of you are too young to remember that movie, but it was very impactful in my life because I realized you could do art with a camera. You could make movies. So my parents were living in Illinois. I could go as a resident student, so I transferred to Southern Illinois University as a cinema major, and a couple of months before I started there, my parents moved to Colorado. Because I had all these art credits from Pratt, it took me 3 more years to get a bachelor's degree. So for the math requirement, I could have stayed in the architecture line. But my expectation then was become some kind of filmmaker. And I went to USC Cinema. It was a 2-year, 4-semester program in cinema. And pretty quickly I realized that I was surrounded by people who had all these attributes for success that I lacked. I had some interesting fellow students, guys named Walter Murch and Caleb Deschanel, and a kid named George Lucas. I don't know whatever happened to him. I was working really hard, and had a part-time job, going to school, but I just didn't feel like I was getting anywhere. So I dropped out after 3 semesters, and I knocked around for a few years. I did some sound recording. I was an assistant editor on documentary films. I worked for a government training project, which amazingly was totally worthless. And no matter how hard I worked, just nothing was happening. And I was out of work, without a car in Los Angeles, which is not a good thing because public transportation is terrible. And I was living in this really dingy 1-room apartment at the Lido Apps. I guess they didn't have enough money to have the sign say apartments. So I got really depressed. I mean, clinically depressed, and I considered taking my own life. I had a pistol that had been given to me by my grandfather, but I didn't have enough money to buy bullets, and I thought it would be kind of dicey to go into a gun shop and ask to borrow a bullet. Yeah, I mean, when you're expecting one thing and you get something else, it's very confusing, disorienting, and you can get depressed and angry. And you've all experienced this. I mean, you are expecting dinner and flowers for your birthday, and you get a vacuum cleaner. Just a tip for you guys, not a good idea. And during this period of time, about every 6 months, because my parents knew how down I was, my mother would send me a new Bible translation in the hopes that I would read it. And I got the Phillips, the Living Bible, the Amplified Bible, the New American Standard, the Revised Standard, Moffat's Version, Good News for Modern Man, the NIV, the NEB, the NTSB. No, that's not. The NTSB is the National Safety Transportation Board. But anyway, I had a lot of Bibles. I had a box of Bibles. And I didn't have any television set, and so I decided to read. And so I read the Gospel of John in every version that I had. And there in that tiny room where hard work had failed, I had a meeting. And I met Jesus the Christ, the Son of the living God. The best meeting ever. And the first thing I decided to do was to abandon any expectations and just try to listen to the Holy Spirit. And I went to this little church. Yes, it was a Southern Baptist church. And the first Sunday I was there, this young lady came in and she said, "Would you like to join the choir?" And I said, "Well, don't you want to know if I can sing?" And she said, "Oh, I don't care if you can sing. I've just been asked to sign people up." That lady was Rita. So a little over a year later, the lady of the lake and I were married. And didn't expect that at all. In 1973, I got my first job, real job in television. I was the associate producer of a show called The Partridge Family. And it was great. It was a successful show. It was the 4th season of the show. ABC moved it against All of the Family, and it was immediately canceled. But that was a good thing because then I was able to get hired as the associate producer on Happy Days. And I was then beginning to sort of expect I would have this career as an associate producer, which was a good thing, yes. But a year after I started that job, the guy that hired me was fired and I was out of work again. And Rita and I had a newborn baby boy and a 2-year-old girl. And so we had to sell our house. I was on unemployment. We moved into a rental in a neighborhood across the street from a park that was known for drug trafficking. I was out of work, but in hindsight, that was a good thing. We spent 9 months together with these kids. It was really quite wonderful and had a lot of far-reaching good repercussions. I was then asked to co-write a screenplay through a complex series of factors, and I had no desire to be a writer. I'd never given any thought to being a writer. I'd never taken any writing classes in college. I didn't want to be a writer probably because I had also failed English in high school and had to take it over. I was really a bad student, and Rita said, "Why not try writing? Maybe you'll like it. And we need the money." And that was not entirely persuasive. And then she said, "Why don't you try writing? Maybe you'll like it, and maybe it's what God wants for you." I was beginning to see a theme there also. And the idea of trying something so foreign was really terrifying. The truth is sometimes, because of our flawed expectations, we don't want to change direction in life because we're so committed to the expectation we have. It's a challenge making sure our expectations are what God desires for us. Later, spell check saved my life. And that exposure of writing through another set of weird circumstances led to me being hired on the writing staff of Happy Days. And that first season, the show was the highest rated TV show in America. So after 8 years of dropping out of USC, I was an overnight success. It was an amazing time. And I began to realize that I had to be willing to accept something I did not expect in life. I mean, after all, that was the way God changed me when I first met him. I wasn't expecting to meet Jesus. I was just reading because I was too broke to buy a book other than those Bibles. When I was trying to live my life my way, it was years of disappointment and failure. And my life has been full of events directed by God that had absolutely nothing to do with my plans or ability or hard work or any of those things. I spent 6 years on the writing staff of Happy Days. I got to work with one of America's iconic characters, the Fonz, and was able to write for him because it was pretty easy. He just went, hey. But Gary Marshall, who was the creator of Happy Days, referred to my partner and I as the Christian guys. So whenever there was an episode that needed a priest or a nun, we were asked to write the episode, which was odd because we weren't Catholics, didn't know anything about priests or nuns. We wrote a show where Henry Winkler, who is Jewish, plays an Italian Catholic character who has a near-death experience and feels like he's got to get right with God, and so he's going to go get baptized. And that was interesting, dealing with the Jewish actor who's asked to play an Italian who wants to get baptized in a Catholic church. Not an easy process. After Happy Days went down after 250 episodes, ABC asked us to produce Perfect Strangers. Well, I'd never produced a show, so I didn't know quite what that was all about, but I figured on-the-job training would work. I don't know if you got Perfect Strangers in Europe. But I was learning how broken people in Hollywood were. I mean, it was really astounding. I mean, almost everybody on our staff and crew had some kind of present or past drug or alcohol problem. My agent once told me that 85% of his writing and producing clients were divorced. 85% of them. And after 2 or 3 months, my secretary came in and said she wanted to talk to me. She said she was a recovering alcoholic. She went to AA meetings on the studio lot. All of her friends were dysfunctional. Their marriages were in trouble. Her marriage was in trouble. And she said, you come to work every day sort of whistling zippity-doo-dah. I mean, what's the deal? Why are you so always up? Come into my office and let's talk about God. And about a year later, she became a Christian. She was the first person I was able to lead to Christ in the business. We just kept writing pilots and shows, and we created a show called Step by Step, which was about a blended family, single mom, single dad with kids. The kids hated each other. Room for lots of humor there. Did a show called Family Matters, which was about a multi-generational African-American family living in Chicago. My contribution to Western civilization is the character of Steve Urkel. His profound philosophical question in life after he caused some disaster was, did I do that? During the last 7 years that we were at Warner Brothers, we had 3 or 4 shows on the air every season. It was really quite remarkable. And I felt a little bit like Naaman. I could relate to his story. Then, in 2001, it all came to an end. ABC got out of the adolescent TV business. My producing partners moved to New York to do Broadway plays. My writing partner pursued a career in directing. I was the last man standing, and I realized I had been so typecast as a writer and producer, I couldn't develop anything with the networks. I discovered that the 850 episodes I'd worked on wasn't what the networks were looking for anymore. So I was out of work again. That was unexpected and scary, but it also turned out to be a good thing because my 2 kids had graduated from college, got married, and I decided it was a good time to go home and be papa to grandkids, which I highly recommend. They're wonderful. God gave me several new jobs. I was on the board of elders at Calvary Community Church for 18 years, much of those as the chairman. I was an interim executive pastor. I taught and still teach at Biola University. lead a couple home Bible study groups, work with missions in Uganda, lots of stuff to do. And it just made me think about maybe, just maybe, somebody in this room is at a point where your expectations have not been realized. Perhaps it's in your ministry, perhaps it's in some relationship. Your sense of purpose has just not turned out to be what you expected it to be. And I think it might be a good thing to look to the Lord, because he may be saying, look, over here, there's something I have for you that you never expected or even dreamed of, that it's going to be really fantastic. I thought of Paul, getting all set to go to Bithynia, and God saying, no, don't go there, go to Macedonia. Totally unexpected, but that was a good thing. You just never know what God has for you until you dip yourself in the water. Can be scary to change direction, but it could be a good thing to think about embracing the unexpected. Thank you.